Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. You can support WitchLit and the serious book habit it requires at ko-fi.com/WitchLitPodcast. And you can be part of the show by sending in your own death, sex, religion, politics, money questions for our guests to victoria@witchlitpod.com. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and give us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help other witches find the show. Here's to never getting to the bottom of our to-be-read piles. Salty-tongued, tattooed mystic, Thorn Coyle is author of the Seashell Cove Paranormal Mysteries, the urban fantasy series The Witches of Portland, the alt history fantasy series The Panther Chronicles, and the epic fantasy series The Steel Clan Saga. Thorn's nonfiction books include Sigil Magic for writers, artists, and other creatives, Kissing the Limitless, Make Magic of Your Life, and Evolutionary Witchcraft. Thorn also released 4 albums of chants and songs, several short story collections, and their work appears in many magazines and anthologies. Thorn Coyle, welcome to WitchLit.
Thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. I have been an admirer of your writing for a long time, and we talked a little bit before, and I'm in the middle of one of your books now, just for fun. So, but our first question for everyone on the show is, in this age of all the ways to communicate, why write? Why write books?
Well, I've always been a writer since I was a tiny child. I started writing poetry very, very young, probably around age 5 or 6, actually. And the written word has always been a way I've loved to express myself. And of course, I often say books saved my life. Literally, I was raised by the library and books, took me out of a fairly traumatic childhood and gave me a place to be. Words gave me a home. And so, I used to teach in person all the time, and I used to travel all over the world doing that. And I love teaching, but it got to be too hard on my body, for one thing. And, I have a chronic illness that got worse and blah, 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 plus air travel, can't stand it. And I also wanted to reach more people. So I went back to an early love of mine, which is fiction. I used to write fiction years ago and gave it up for writing nonfiction. And then fiction came back full force. And I've always loved magical fiction too. Reading magical fiction as a teenager was part of the way in which I studied magic. I studied the craft. And there's so much more I actually can embed in fiction than I can in nonfiction, because in nonfiction, you have to make everything make rational sense,
right?
On some level. In fiction, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which direction you approach it from. Whether you believe it's real, don't believe it's real, whether you think it's fantasy, whether you think, magic exists around us, it doesn't matter, because it's just a story. Mm-hmm. And our subconscious gets to play with magic, with magical concepts, with different ideas, with possibilities. And so I love the freedom fiction allows me. And I can just communicate a lot more clearly because I'm not trying to communicate with your rational mind. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to communicate subconscious to subconscious.
Yeah, I love that. So you mentioned that you had started out writing fiction and then started publishing nonfiction. So what was that first publishing journey like, of publishing nonfiction before you rejoined fiction writers?
Well, that's kind of a saga too. When I was a teenager, I thought I wanted to be a journalist. And so I quit high school at age 16, went to community college, was studying journalism, was working for a local newspaper, then discovered pretty quickly journalism was not the way I wanted to go for a lot of reasons, including it was hard to find a publication that I felt was ethical. They were few and far between. And now we see the ways in which news, is so biased and corrupted. And it's I really feel for people who are trying to do honest, ethical journalism these days. I think it's a tough row. So I was writing nonfiction and publishing nonfiction. I was also publishing articles. I was writing for tattoo magazines and arts journals and things like that. But all that time, I was also practicing fiction. But I was in a trap, in a cycle that a lot of early writers get into, which is the trap of perfection. Excuse me. It's why I now have a class online called Kicking Out Perfection, because perfectionism is death to art, right? And so I would work on the same short story for a year, which just kills your creative voice. And it kills any connection your subconscious had to the story. So I was working too hard because I wanted my fiction to be as perfect as I thought all the books that, transported me in my childhood were. And so nonfiction for me was just easier. It felt more straightforward. I could just write what I needed to write, say what I needed to say, and send it off. I didn't have the same emotional attachment to it. Mm-hmm. So it was easier to do what I call write and release. And then, of course, I sold Evolutionary Witchcraft, my first published long-scale book, and thought, okay, maybe I just need to focus on nonfiction right now. And so fiction took a back burner. My teaching increased. My nonfiction writing increased. I was blogging all the time, teaching classes, doing all that. But of course, I was always still reading novels and short stories and loving them. And then one day I was sitting in my living room, staring out at the sunlight on the trees of an elm tree out my window. And a thought entered my head and it said, I hate those leaves. I hate the light on those leaves. And I was like, who is that? That's not me. Mm-hmm. Well, it was a character named Jonah who was depressed because his best friend had just been killed. And so those characters came knocking and I followed their story and I wrote Alex and Jonah's story, my first novel called Like Water. And then I realized what I wanted to do was double down and study fiction. Mm-hmm. So I took a break, dove into classes, took as many classes as possible, practiced as much as possible, wrote a bunch of short fiction, loved it, and then started writing novels full force. And now that's mostly what I do, and I love it.
Yeah. I love that story of like a character catching you by surprise like that. I mean, it's just a gift as a writer to be open to that when it happens and not just kind of go, okay, whatever, and walk away from that. So that's a lovely story. So I've read some online where you've talked about kind of making the switch from kind of your initial fiction, which was a little grittier, I guess, to this new kind of direction with cozy. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that because I think it's something, like that perfection trap, writers get in a trap of, if I'm not writing literature or American greatest novel, that I'm not a writer, like that somehow writing in romance or cozy mystery or those kind of things is lesser.
Right.
And so I really want to give you a chance to talk about it because I think it's so important to realize that's not true.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So my first novel did lean a little, even though there was a ghost in it, it did lean more towards the literary end of the spectrum. And I thought maybe I would go that direction. Like I thought, well, maybe I should go to an MFA program or something. And I did get accepted into an MFA writing program, but I didn't get the full scholarship I needed. And I was like, why am I going to pay all this money to do something? I already have a career, I don't need to do this. So the people I started studying with were genre fiction writers. They're award winners in pretty much every category, mystery, romance, science fiction, fantasy. And of course, I love all those genres and I've always read all those genres. So I was writing genre fiction, but it was still a little more serious. Like the Panther Chronicles is alternate history, urban fantasy with sorcery in it and magic. And, but it's definitely about battling evil, and it's got a lot of social politics, social justice woven through it. And The Witches of Portland is similar. The Witches of Portland, I think, are slightly lighter, for lack of a better word, but they still deal with themes that are a little more serious. But what I found was, particularly with COVID, it was a combination of things. I had a bike crash, got a concussion, had to slow down, had to figure out what I could or could not do. Then I got a virus that compounded the brain injury, right? And it really started to shift my brain in an interesting way. And at the time, I was in the middle of writing the Steel Clan Saga, which is my action adventure, queer, epic fantasy, motorcycle, swords, and dragons trilogy, which I love. And I found it was too complicated for what I was dealing with at the time. And also, it was too much to be writing during the height of the pandemic. I needed an escape from the more serious fiction. So even though it was genre fiction, it was still more serious fiction. And the combination of all of those things, I started writing bonkers, paranormal, cozy mystery, the Seashell Cove series, about a black cat and a witch in a bookshop in a tiny town on the Oregon coast. And wow, you've been reading the series, you know how bonkers and wacky it is. And I just let my subconscious out to play. It's like, oh, you want there to be centaurs in the woods? Great. Now there's centaurs. Oh, there's a gnome. Great. There's gnomes. I just let my subconscious do whatever it wanted to. And my critical voice just went away. And that has been such a gift. So in a strange way, getting a concussion and not being able to write my epic fantasy, and then having COVID on top, the COVID pandemic on top of it, gave me the gift of shunting my critical voice aside. It put the voice that said you should only be writing this or that into a box and shipped it far, far away. So I feel very grateful in a bizarre way. Of course, the pandemic has been horrible and it's ongoing and it's still horrible and impacting us all. And of course, having a chronic illness and getting a concussion were not fun. But everything life offers us, as horrible as it is, and I'm overstating this a bit, no matter what hardships we're dealing with, if we can make a little bit of space and take a breath, there might be some tiny, tiny, tiny gift there. Maybe it's a gift of time. Maybe it's a gift of saying, I don't have to work so hard because I can't work so hard. So it's not about saying bad things don't happen and they're not horrible. It's about saying, is there a piece of magic here that I can be open to when I pause and listen for a moment? And I'm grateful for all my years of magical and spiritual practice, because they enabled me to pause and listen and say, what does my body need right now? What does my mind need right now? How can I actually take care of myself? And in doing that form of listening, it enabled me to open up to writing something I never would have written 4 years ago. So I feel grateful for that, despite the fact that it sucked.
Yeah.
It's a both and situation. So that's a super long answer to a short question of, because I read years ago when I was going through tough times, I would read cozy mysteries because they were all I could read. And they took me away and they were a joy. And so in this time, that came back through the writing of them. I just have so much fun writing about Rhiannon and Sarah and their wacky friends in Seashell Cove. And as a consequence, it's become one of my most popular series, which is amazing to me.
Yeah. I think it just landed at the right time when everybody was kind of looking for that too. I think maybe it's a place, it feels very real in the books. Like it's a place you could escape to.
Yeah.
So I think that has a lot to do with that. There's a couple things in your long answer that, I love that we can do this on podcasts, that I wanted to tease out of that. One of them was this idea of that kind of creative freedom and to be able to do that. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that these are self-published, through your publishing company. And so you have total control of this from beginning to end. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about that and maybe kind of like how you made the decision to do that through Kickstarter and how that worked. And just like, what was that whole experience of really having 100% control and getting this funded that way?
Well, I've been traditionally published and had both good and bad experiences with being traditionally published. But being able to run my own publishing company is part of what has made it possible for me to publish fiction, because I just wasn't about to jump through the hoops of traditional publishing with fiction. I have seen too many people go through it. I have too many friends who are still in the middle of it. And I didn't want to do it. So there was that first portion of freedom, right? But the other thing is, for example, I had a couple of friends of mine who write cozy mysteries read an early draft of Bookshop Witch, just to check my cozy levels and make sure the voice was right. And they both said, yeah, the voice is right, the tone is right. And one of them said, though, cozy readers tend to be more conservative. Like you've got a non-binary character, your protagonist is bisexual, and I said, great, thanks for the input. And so on Kickstarter, I branded them Cozy Mysteries for Freaks and Geeks. And that took off. I was shocked at how well that Kickstarter did for Bookshop Witch for the first 3 books of the series. People really responded to it because, of course, there's an audience for cozy mysteries for freaks and geeks. Of course, people want stories about witches and queer people and non-white people and all the rest of it, right? I think it would have been a very hard sell to a traditional publisher. I think no one would have taken on these books, and yet there's an audience for them. So I'm able to bypass those gatekeepers that try to tell us, queer protagonists aren't going to sell, Black protagonists aren't going to sell, Asian or neurodivergent or depressed or chronically ill characters aren't going to sell. No, they will. There's an audience. There are people who really want diversity in their books. And the Kickstarter process has made that clear. Yeah. People got very excited about the series. And I probably wouldn't have been able to sell my my bizarre epic fantasy trilogy either to a traditional publisher. And yet those books are finding an audience also. So I could go on about that, but I'm not sure. Is that sort of an answer to your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting to me. Like, I think that is one of the gifts of indie publishing, is that these books that aren't what mainstream publishing thinks people want to read, or they don't want to invest the money to check, I guess, even to see, that indie publishing gives us a way to do that. I mean, I kind of did the same thing you did. I did originally publish with like an independent press, and then got my rights back, and my husband and I said, let's just do this ourselves. So we kind of did the same thing. And like having that control and being able to say, no, I'm going to write between the lines. I'm going to have characters that reflect my reality.
Yes, exactly.
Reality in general, those kind of things. So yeah, I think it's important. And, there's been a huge market for witchy cozies. Why not witchy queer cozies? I mean,
right.
Why not? So yeah, I love that. So one of the things I do think is interesting about being a practitioner and writing witch fiction or magical fiction, is that difference between, and this is probably even more so for you since you've actually written nonfiction about practice, is that line where you go from this is reality magic to this is sci-fi CG magic. So how do you make a decision about what magic looks like in your world? Like, how do you decide like how much special effects that magic is going to be?
It really depends on the tone of the series. Like, one of the pieces of feedback I consistently get about my Witches of Portland series is how real the magic is. Yeah. You know, it's very true to Coven magic. It's very although the thing people say is unreal is how well all the Coven members get along. They always say, wow, I wish my Coven was like Arrow and Crescent Coven. So I stuck closer to what actual magical practitioners know in the Witches of Portland series, which people really respond to. In the Seashell Cove series, the book that starts with Bookshop Witch, I wanted it to be a lot faster and looser. I mean, Sarah, our main witch in the series, she does do stuff that a magical practitioner of today would recognize. You know, there's grounding and centering, there's connecting to the earth, there's connecting to the ocean, to the sky, there's working with gods, there's, working with her mother's crystal ball, right? And the preparation she does to work with the crystal ball. All of that is familiar. But then I also just let stuff be wacky. I let there be, sparks flying out of fingertips. I let there be all these magical creatures actually exist in Seashell Cove that maybe people think they exist magically, maybe they don't, right? So I allow myself to play a lot more and blur the lines of what is real, what is not real, because in that world and in the story I'm telling, it doesn't matter. It's about, I always write about a world I want to live in. And so this is a world, it's another facet of the world I want to live in, and there's still community coming together to fight off whatever is trying to harm their town, right? And that's important to me, just as it was in the Witches of Portland, just as it is in the Steel Clan saga, right? My stories are always about magic and community. So yeah, the magic is less real, quote unquote, in the Seashell Cove series, but the heart of it is still real for me. And that's what matters. Mm-hmm. The heart of it still has to be there.
And I think that shows, and I do love that thread through your fiction of magic being a community effort in this piece. One of the things I was like, especially reading during COVID, it was like how desperately I would love to go to a coffee shop and meet with people.
Yeah.
So getting that little taste of that one thing I've really missed a lot. But I love that. And so kind of, I guess, switching gears a little bit, I reread recently your Sigils book just because I wanted to have it a little more fresh to talk about. And you talk about in the book kind of your writing practice. So I guess that's, the book is what, 2015? So
2015 it was published. So I was writing it in like 2014.
Yeah. So in that time, things may have changed, but I just kept what is a perfect writing day for you? Like, what does that look like? And how do you set yourself up for that? Are you more in catch as you can, maybe than what the book would belie, I guess?
My writing practice changes probably every 6 months, but it's always steady. I am committed to it. And part of why it shifts is depending on what's happening with my chronic illness. So sometimes all I can do is, there were periods, for example, when I was writing The Witches of Portland actually came about because all I could do at the time was lie on the couch and think and watch videos of what other writers were doing. And that's how I came up with, there's this coven. It's 9 people. They're each going to get a book. We're going to build this world together, etc. So there's that part of it. It's listening to, again, my body. What can I do? But I am committed to writing, just like I'm committed to meditation and prayer practice. And so when I'm writing, I do write every day. And I do try to set, according to what project I'm working on, a word count goal. Mm-hmm. And I do use Sigil Magic to help me, to help boost my energy and my focus and set those targets and aim for those targets consistently. So sometimes I need to get up and write right away first thing in the morning, and get my words out. And then in the afternoon, I'll do business and publishing and all the other stuff I need to do to run my life and my work. Other times, depending on what's happening with me, my brain is not so clear in the morning. So then I know I'm going to set time aside in the afternoon to write, and I'm fortunate that this is my full-time job. I don't have to work another full-time job. Friends of mine who do that, who also have chronic illnesses, they also work consistently and figure out ways to work consistently. So maybe for one of my friends, it's half an hour every morning before they go to work. For other people, it's half an hour on their lunch break, 3 days a week, right? So consistency for me is the key to creativity. Waiting for the muse to show up means the muse isn't going to show up. Years ago when I was teaching psychic skills regularly, I would draw upon this one author, Sonia Choquette, who has been a psychic since she was a child and teaches a lot of psychic work. And she talks about, if you want your intuition to show up regularly, you have to pay attention to it, right? So if your intuition says, I need to take my vitamins, you stop everything and you go take your vitamins. You don't wait for a convenient moment. And then your intuition shows up more consistently. And it's the same with creative practice. It's the same with calling upon, meditation, right? If I keep showing up to write, then the writing shows up for me, right? And my best writing days are the days when I can sit down and write 3,000 words every single day, because then I really reach what pilots call, or people who study birds call, ground effect, right? You're just coasting along and it's no effort. I'm immersed in the story's moving through me. I'm barely having to do anything. All I have to do is show up every day and put my hands on the keyboard, right? And so consistency is key. But it shifts and changes according to what's happening in my life, what's happening with my health. There were times when what I needed to do was go for a walk and do dictation to get story out, because sitting and writing was too hard for my brain. Right now, these days, I've been joining YouTube writing sprints with other writers because it's just fun. It's like showing up at the office. There's other people there. We set a timer. We go for 20 minutes, take a 5-minute break and chat in the, chat room, and then go again. Right. So I do change up what works for me, but I always show up and make space for what's going to work for me.
Yeah. Well, and clearly it works because you're a very prolific writer.
Yeah.
So clearly you're doing the right thing.
It is my writing and publishing is my full-time job. So,
And I do think that makes a difference, the consistency of it. Do you find that you kind of have to rethink some of that between projects, or do you kind of just glide from one project into the next project?
Usually need a little break. Sometimes if I'm writing in the same series, sometimes I only need a break of a few days. Other times, like right now, I'm coming off of writing the first 3 books of the Pride Street paranormal cozies that will launch next year. And, reworking the Sigil Magic book. And I'm also planning yet another book that's been on the back burner, nonfiction that's been on the back burner for a while, and running my Kickstarters. And so I've been writing some short stories. I have been writing the next Seashell Cove book, but not full force.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in the back of my mind, like it's starting to push at me going, hey, like get back to me. Sarah and Rhiannon really want you to get back.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that's coming. And I just finished a short story today. So I think probably this weekend, I will dive back into Seashell Cove. So I have needed a buffer of, a couple weeks to work on other stuff, do other things, but I don't let it go for too long.
Yeah.
I want to stay immersed in the world as much as possible.
Yeah. And just talking with other writers for the thing, like COVID for me was a fallow period in a lot of ways. Like we had a cross country move, my kids were home and then they moved out. I mean, there was just a lot of stuff going on, like just in life. And I really struggled with writing. I did a lot of other creative things, but I didn't write a lot. And I kind of had to stop beating myself about that I just changed channels and writing wasn't a channel. And I finally was like, oh, you did do a lot of stuff. You just didn't write, you know? And it was just that, no, you just needed to do something else. So.
Yeah. And that's important too. It's important to give yourself grace and, life happens, but can we create other things? That's important.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I'm an amateur photographer. I go for walks, I take photos, I frame the world I see, and that really fills my well and feeds me. And so other forms of creativity help keep what's my primary form of creativity moving too, even if I'm not writing full force like I am at other times.
Yeah.
And also taking in creativity, reading books, watching movies, all of that is important too. Listening to music, Yeah,
I think that feeding the well idea has been really, I think, something that took me a little bit to learn that was part of the creative process.
Yeah.
Like instead of feeling like, oh, I should be writing, not watching someone else's movie or whatever. You're like, no, you need to do these things too.
Oh, yeah.
And it feeds it. So.
Oh, yeah. And, the less we beat ourselves up, the more our creativity is going to show up. Right.
Yeah.
So am I honoring a commitment or am I beating myself up?
Mm-hmm.
So there are days when maybe I don't 100% feel like sitting down and writing. And those are the days when I say, just write one sentence, see what happens. I invite myself to engage with my creativity. And sometimes on those days, I write 200 words and that's it. Other times I sit down and write a sentence and look up and it's 2,000 words later, right? So can we keep just inviting ourselves towards creativity? That's an act of magic too. Magic is an invitation into presence. And so I think what's important is to allow ourselves the gift of being present with the creative flow. Because of course the cosmos itself is creative. And all we have to do is allow ourselves to take a breath and pay attention.
It's kinder to ourselves too. It's just so much kinder to yourself, not to go there because you want to be there. And like you said, and you bring this up in the Sigil's book too, that if you do sit down thinking, I can't do this today, and you get 200 words, that's a success for that day.
That's right. Yeah. One of my writing mentors, Dean Wesley Smith, talks about failing to success. So you might call it a failure, but really you have succeeded. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I really loved that whole little section because I was just like, yeah, that's something I do think that creatives often are our own worst enemies.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I see so many writers complaining about writing and how they hate writing and they have to chain themselves to the desk or they're doing anything but write. And I'm like, that's a terrible abusive relationship. So maybe we can change our relationship and make it a more playful, gentle, and generous one.
I love that. So one of the things I think about feeding the well too, especially when you're writing nonfiction, is the research aspect of it. And I mean, often that is the part, even with writing fiction, that I love, and it's really easy to go down those rabbit holes for days. Um, how do you look at research? Like when you're approaching a project that's going to require research, either fiction or nonfiction, like what is your strategy around that, or what do you enjoy or don't enjoy about that part?
Again, it varies from project to project. The Panther Chronicles were research heavy because even though they're urban fantasy, they are alternate history. Mm-hmm. So I had to get the history right, and I had to get a lot of the details right. And Seashell Cove, the paranormal cozies are refreshing because they require pretty much no research, right? I just write. But the short story I just finished today, I did have to do a little bit of research. It's about dangerous mermaids, and I had to do a little bit of research on whaling ships and contemporary whaling practices. But I didn't let myself go down a rabbit hole. I looked up like 3 or 4 key things I needed because it's only a 3,000 word short story.
Right.
And I like to think of what another mentor of mine, Christine Catherine Rush, she's award-winning in all genres. She's an amazing writer. In one of her classes, she talks about the telling detail, right? And she talks about researching one of her series is set in the 1960s, and she was looking at photographs to do research and remembered something she knew but had forgotten. And that is, in hospitals, there used to be ashtrays bolted to the walls between the elevators, right? That's a telling detail. If there's an ashtray in a hospital, you immediately are taken there. You've got taste and smell engaged. So your senses are engaged, and you know what time period you're in.
Right.
And it's not our time period, right? That's all you need. It's a telling detail. I think sometimes people over research and it becomes an avoidance.
Yeah.
Right. The other thing that's good to remember is maybe 1 to 10% of your audience are going to be experts. Right. Most people, all they need is enough that it feels real to your world. Right. So for some of my projects, I do research, but I try to not let it interfere with the writing. Right. I want enough research to build the world and make it realistic. But I don't need to know every single thing about how this particular weapon works. Or another thing I'll do, this is kind of an aside, but it's an important one, especially for fantasy authors, is I'll write something and then have an expert check it out. Like in the Steel Clan saga in book 1, I would write a battle scene with what I know from research I'd already done. But then I had a friend of mine who's a weapons expert look at it. And so he said he was able to help me adjust my choreography a little bit. But again, it was simple. I didn't research for a year.
Yeah.
Which I could have done.
Right. You could have taken classes. You could have done all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, and I think that sometimes an underutilized resource is like people who are experts in stuff. They love to talk about what they're an expert in. They'll happily tell you.
Yeah. My Pride Street series, one of the point of view characters is a corgi. And so I had my friend who has a corgi read a draft of book 1, and she found 3 things to correct that I had gotten wrong about corgis. And I was like, that's awesome. But that's all I needed.
Yeah.
Yes, I did some research on the breed. Yes, for one of the books, I had to research dog shows. But I don't need to know everything about corgis in order to write from a corgi's point of view. All I have to do is drop into a dog's brain.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think that, like 1 to 10% of your readers will be expert in whatever it is you're writing about. And the telling detail come together. And this other idea that I got from a writing conference I was at, where they were like, it's good to know what you need to know to write this, but understand that you will only use 10% of the research you do.
That's right.
It's more important that your reader understands that you know what's going on so they can just suspend their disbelief. And I was like, yeah, that really is true.
Yeah, and that's also true of world building. You know, some people take years and years to world build, and then by the time they go to write the books, gosh, is it even any fun? You know, part of what I love about writing is the discovery of my world through my characters' eyes and ears. So for my Steel Clans saga, I was working on other books while I was doing some brainstorming. I always let series percolate in the back of my head for a while I'm working on other things. And so I did a lot of world building about what kind of technology would they have, because it's like 50, 60 years post-apocalyptic, you know, and what would it look like living on a river? What sort of engineering would they have? Oh, well, they could have motorcycles, but I don't want guns. So why wouldn't they have guns? Right. So I did that. I allowed myself that sort of world building. Almost none of that made it into the book.
But you knew.
I knew, and it helped me fashion the characters. And the important thing is I didn't do that instead of writing. Right.
It was just percolating.
I was working on other projects and letting that percolate and making notes on occasion.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Do you have like a system? You say that, and I'm looking out. I have a random collection of Moleskine, the little cardboard paperback ones that I have for projects that I make notes in. Do you have a system that you do that? How you keep notes for different projects?
Has just one of those composition books, because I do better. Like my editor does keep a series Bible for me, and I do try to update.
Bless them.
I know.
I
bless my editor, right? So I do say, here's new characters in this series. Here's physical things. Here's some new places that you need to make sure in this series. So I do have a series Bible, but my brain does not work well with that. What my brain works well with is just a simple composition book. You can even get them at the dollar store. Yeah. And I just write notes for every book about the characters, the places. For the mysteries, I also write down like key clues or key events. So then if I need to cycle back and shift stuff, I can, or I know, oh, that came up in chapter 7. So I'm not saying, where did we mention this? So I can make sure it's accurate by the time I get to chapter 30. Yeah. So just a cheap composition book.
Yeah, I admire people who can do it all digitally, but my brain does not work that way. I need it. Yeah. I need a pen and I need paper.
I do too.
Yeah. But I love people who get nerdy about Scrivener and what they can do in it. Like, I love to listen to it. I'm like, that's fabulous for you. I will continue to write in pages and take notes on paper.
See, I do write in Scrivener, but I use probably 1/10 of what Scrivener offers. Yeah. I just like Scrivener because I like being able to see. For example, especially if I'm alternating points of view, I like knowing, chapter 1 is Marcia, chapter 2 is Garrett, and I make a note about where they are. Yeah. So I can easily glance at my Scrivener document and see where I am in the story, but that's about the extent.
But I mean, you're getting use out of it, so that's good. I tried Scrivener early on. My partner actually got a free copy through his work, and he's like, you should try this. And I just was like, oh, there's this 2-hour class you watch. And I was like, no.
See, I never watched the class. I never did anything. I basically just opened it up and started using it.
Yeah, maybe I should give it another shot. I don't know. But I have a nonfiction project I'm going to work on that may require a little more organization than usual. So I may have to try it.
Yeah, I have friends that use all the Scrivener tags and, all of that. And I don't.
Yeah, it's an impressive tool. I mean, I think, it is, as a writer, it's an interesting time to just what's available to you. Oh. Tool wise, it's fantastic. And some of it.
And as a publisher too. Yeah. I mean, there are so many tools that make the publishing so easy now. It's astounding. Even, compared to even 4 years ago. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think of programs like Vellum and stuff like that if you are not versed in Adobe Creative Suite, you can still put a book together. There's just.
Yeah. I mean, when I published my first novel, I was trying to use InDesign, and it's just horrible to me. I know people who love it, but again, my brain doesn't work that way.
Right.
But now I use Vellum and I use BookBrush, and I design my own covers. I can do all my own formatting. So it saves me time. It saves me money.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I did not know that you did your own covers. Good work.
Yeah.
They're well done.
The only series that I didn't do my own covers was The Witches of Portland. And the Steel Clan Saga, I hired out character art, but I did all the cover design.
Oh, nice.
Valerie Heron did the characters for me. She's a pagan artist who's amazing.
Yeah.
But I loved doing my own covers, and it's another creative thing for me.
Yeah. I lucked out in that my partner worked for Ingram when they started print on demand and did cover art for books that they were converting. So I get my cover art done in-house and I get my say.
That is great.
Yeah, the money you save in being able to do that is tremendous because artists should get paid, and it is expensive to pay them. So yeah. When you're starting out, it's good to be able to do some of that stuff in-house. That's for sure. Awesome. So I guess as someone who's written nonfiction and fiction about witches, one of the questions I always like to ask people who are writing nonfiction books is there something in your writing that has happened in your writing or while you're writing that has impacted your practice as a witch cunning person, whatever label you choose to use in your magic practice? Has there been anything like that for you, that like something has come from your writing that really impacted your practice?
That is a really interesting question. And, it's hard for me to say because my writing and my magical practice are so intertwined and they really feed each other. And I would not do the writing I do without my magical practice. And my writing is part of my magical practice. I'm trying to seed more magic in the world through my writing. And the main thing I do is try to tap into that and remember that. So it's not that my writing has changed my magic as much as it is that my writing is part of my magic.
Yeah. I like that too. And kind of to riff on that point about seeding magic in the world, I mean, what do you hope your readers take away from your work?
I'm trying to help people connect to their own magic and to a world filled with possibility. My tagline as a writer is magic is real and justice is worth fighting for. And that's what I try to infuse all my writing with, no matter what it is. And in my writing, I'm trying to build a world I want to live in. I'm hoping other people want to live in that world too. Or more importantly, that it inspires people to say, what kind of world do I value? What kind of world am I striving to create with my friends and my family and my communities and my magic? That's what I'm trying to put out in the world, is the thought that each of us have the possibility to collectively create a world that is filled with beauty and nurturing and creativity and justice, and a world where there's plenty for all of us. And each of us have our own lens on that. Each of us has our own angle and facet and way of listening to that world and speaking to that world. And so I'm just hoping that I can inspire a little bit of that in everyone. And you know what? If all my books do is provide people with some comfort and escape because life feels hard, that's also awesome.
Yeah.
I love that too.
Oh, I like that too. So before we get to our game of chance at the end, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about stuff coming up and what you're working on and where folks can find your stuff or get in touch with you or all of those things.
Yeah. So my website is thorncoyle.com. So that's pretty easy. You can find all my work on there, and I do try to keep it updated. My Pride Street cozy series will launch in February, but between then, I've got some more Seashell Cove books coming out. I've got a Solstice Witch coming out in December. I've got a story collection coming out with my character I love, Jasper, the ghost talking leather daddy. That'll be out this month. And then I'm launching another Kickstarter next week for an update on my Sigil Magic for writers, artists, and other creatives. And I really wanted to expand that book. Partially just because of how my creative world has expanded and partially because of the changes in our external world. I felt like the book needed more sigils and wanted more sigils. And so I've got 6 more sigils already written, and then 6 more planned. If it funds quickly, I'll add more and more sigils to that. So if people can already click on it to sign up to get an alert for when it launches, or they can just go to Kickstarter on next Tuesday and look me up and it'll be there.
Awesome. And I'll make sure there are links to all that in the show notes for folks.
Thanks.
And then our last question is a little game of chance that I joke that because I'm a Scorpio that I like to talk about things we're not supposed to talk about, which is also, as listeners know, apparently why I started a podcast. So I am going to roll this lovely metal die. And depending on what number I get, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which one you'd like. So, and they are related to your work or writing, or I try not to like just have out of left field questions. So 3, religion. I always feel like this one is hard for witches because some of us are religious and some of us are not. But this one is more for writers. So if you got to cast your own canon of sainted writers, who would you pick? Like your top 3 sainted writers?
Wow, top 3. That is tough. James Baldwin has had a huge impact on my life. Ursula Le Guin. And gosh, there's so many others. I'd say every poet.
I like your cheating, although there's no rules in this game. So
I know.
Really cheat.
So, I'd have to put a tie. Maybe I'll put a tie for number 3 as Octavia Butler and Pablo Neruda.
Oh, wow. Yeah. You hit on some of my personal faves, too.
I could name so many poets that have had a huge impact on my life. And, of course, nonfiction writers, too,
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a really hard question.
It is a hard question. And I was thinking about this. I had a meeting last night with my tradition, and we were talking about ancestor practice and the concept of ancestors that are not blood ancestors, but your lineage and either what you do, either your practice or your work. And I was thinking about like those writing ancestors and who those are and how to honor those folks. And those same names, a lot of those same names popped up for me too.
Yeah, I talk about those as ancestors of spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Ancestors of blood and spirit. And a friend of mine even got me, how they make votive candles for different people. Like, there's Dolly Parton votive candles, et cetera. So a friend of mine gave me a James Baldwin votive candle, which I really love. Yeah.
Yeah. I like the Dolly Parton ones, but there's like a tiny part of me. It's like, I don't want a votive candle of someone who's alive.
Yes.
Like I have a little weirdness around that.
Yes, I agree. It is a little strange, but Dolly is a bodhisattva, and bless Dolly Parton.
Oh yeah, we are lucky to have her.
Yes,
I think about that a lot. It's like, I remember when David Bowie died, and people were like, instead of being sad, just be grateful that you got to share the planet while he was here. Yeah, and I was like, yeah, I felt that way about Dolly Parton.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Especially, I'm from East Tennessee too, so she's she's a local saint already. So.
Yeah, I remember Tuatha Dea talking about they got money from her during, when they were destroyed, their homes were destroyed in the
during
fires.
The fire. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, she is a remarkable human and just somehow seems to coast above everything, which I just admire her ability to just I'm going to be this for everyone.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. May we take a lesson from her.
yeah, exactly. Oh, Thorn, thank you so much for being on the show. I want to be respectful of your time because I know you said you had a hard cutoff today, but just thanks for being on and thanks for sharing your wisdom. And hopefully when you have new books come out, let's do this again.
Please. This was really fun. Thanks very much for inviting me, and thank everyone for listening.
Great.
Blessed be.
WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew Kay, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shanekar. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram at witchlitpod. Thanks for listening and for reading witchy.